General George S. Patton, of the most brilliant military minds of the 20th century. He led his troops to victory in World War II, but just months after the war ended, Patton was dead. A car accident, they said. But what if it wasn't? What if Patton's death was not a tragic accident, but something far more sinister? Something orchestrated by those within his own ranks. In this documentary, we uncover the chilling truth behind Patton's death, revealing a conspiracy so deep that it has remained hidden for decades. Could one of America's most celebrated generals have been silenced for what he knew? The year was 1945. World War II was finally coming to an end, and General George S. Patton, the fiery, outspoken leader of the U.S. Third Army, had just completed a string of remarkable victories in Europe. Patton's bold tactics and fearless leadership had made him a hero, both on the battlefield and back home in the United States. Yet, despite his success, Patton was not universally beloved. His brash demeanor and controversial views had earned him enemies not only among the Nazis, but within the highest ranks of the American military and government. Patton's hatred of communism and his open criticism of Soviet actions during the war put him at odds with some of the most powerful figures in Washington. He had even suggested that the Allies should have turned their attention to the Soviet Union after defeating the Nazis, a view that deeply troubled American leadership. Patton believed that the Soviet Union posed a greater long-term threat to the world than Nazi Germany ever had, and he was not afraid to speak his mind. This made him a target for those who preferred to focus on rebuilding post-war relations with the Soviets, rather than confronting them head-on. Yet, Patton was not just a loose cannon. His insight into military strategy, his ability to inspire his men, and his success on the battlefield were undeniable. He was one of the few figures who had the ability to take bold actions that could change the course of history. But this very brilliance may have made him dangerous to some within the U.S. government, especially in the delicate diplomatic climate that followed the war. By the time the war in Europe ended, Patton had become a highly controversial figure whose influence, if left unchecked, could undermine American post-war efforts. Soon after the war ended, Patton was removed from active combat and assigned to a less prominent role. He was left to recover from the emotional toll the war had taken on him, and he spent some time recuperating in Germany. Despite being sidelined, Patton remained vocal in his political opinions, especially regarding the Soviet Union. His growing frustration with the American government's post-war policies was evident to those who interacted with him. Then, in December 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident. He was traveling in a vehicle with his driver, Horace Woodring, when the car collided with a truck. The crash left Patton severely injured. He broke his neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. Despite being rushed to a hospital, Patton's injuries were too severe, and he died just 12 days later, on the 21st of December, 1945. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, but there were many who believed that the circumstances surrounding Patton's death were far too convenient. The car crash, the lack of a full investigation, and the swift official conclusion that Patton's death was an accident raised suspicions. Those close to Patton, including his family, questioned the events leading up to the crash. How could a seasoned military leader like Patton, who had been trained in the harshest conditions and had seen countless battles, have been caught off guard in such a way? The more we delve into the details of Patton's death, the more the truth seems to slip through the cracks. Was it really just an accident? Or was something much darker at play, something orchestrated by those with the power to silence a man who could have changed the course of history? From the moment of Patton's death, questions began to mount. The official report from the Army stated that the crash was caused by a simple accident, an unfortunate collision between Patton's car and a truck. But for those closest to Patton, this explanation didn't sit right. After all, General Patton was a man who had lived through some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. He had led his troops through North Africa, Sicily, and France, battling enemies far more formidable than a truck driver. Yet, this accident was the one that would take his life? Adding to the suspicion was the fact that Patton's car crash happened just days after he had made several public statements about the future of the Soviet Union and the Western powers' stance towards Russia. Patton's outspoken criticism of Stalin and his anti-communist views were no secret, and many believed that his views were causing major friction between him and those in Washington. Patton's vocal stance on these issues had made him a target for those in power who were more focused on maintaining a positive relationship with the Soviet Union rather than confronting it head-on. In the wake of the accident, a number of strange coincidences began to emerge. First, there was the timing. Patton's accident occurred just after his return from a highly controversial mission in Europe. He had been involved in discussions with key military and political leaders, some of whom were known to be wary of Patton's increasingly independent stance. Was it possible that these leaders saw Patton as a threat to the political order they were trying to establish post-war? His views on confronting the Soviets were seen as dangerous to the peace efforts and the fragile alliances that the United States had worked so hard to establish after defeating the Nazis. Then, there was the peculiar way in which Patton's car accident happened. It occurred in a fairly isolated area of Germany, and there were conflicting reports from the people who witnessed the crash. The truck that collided with Patton's car was supposedly driving at a slow speed, which seemed inconsistent with the severity of the crash. Furthermore, the truck driver's identity remained unclear for some time, and there was no real investigation into whether the crash was caused by negligence or something more deliberate. The lack of a thorough investigation into the accident itself added fuel to the fire of those who believed Patton's death wasn't an accident at all. Patton's injuries were also suspicious. Despite being an experienced driver and military leader, he reportedly suffered a neck injury so severe that it rendered him paralyzed from the neck down. For a man who had lived through numerous battles, it seemed almost unbelievable that a seemingly minor car accident could leave him so gravely injured. His family and friends found it difficult to accept that someone with such a robust physical history could have been brought down by something so trivial. Moreover, it was reported that Patton had been in relatively good health prior to the accident, which only raised more doubts about the nature of his injuries. As the investigation into the crash continued, those close to Patton began to question the official narrative. Why had the Army been so quick to conclude that it was an accident? Why wasn't there a more thorough examination of the circumstances surrounding Patton's death? And what was the Army trying to hide? As the pieces of this puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear Patton's death was more than just a random accident. It was a calculated move. But by whom and why? Meanwhile, further questions emerged surrounding Patton's health in the days leading up to the accident. Those who had been with him in the final weeks of his life reported that Patton had been unusually anxious. He had confided in some of his close associates about his concerns for his safety and his belief that there were powerful forces conspiring against him. He had even joked, albeit darkly, that someone might be planning to take him out. Was Patton simply paranoid, or was there something more to his suspicions? At the time of the accident, Patton had been preparing for a new post-war assignment in the United States. However, some believe that he had already made enemies within his own government and military. Patton's critics had long been suspicious of his political views, and they feared that he might become an obstacle to America's growing diplomatic efforts with the Soviet Union. Patton's open disdain for Stalin and his outspoken comments about a potential war with the Soviet Union made him a liability to those who sought to avoid further conflict. Patton's family, particularly his wife Beatrice, was adamant that his death was no accident. She questioned the rapid conclusion of the military's investigation and pushed for a more thorough examination of the circumstances. Beatrice was not the only one who believed there was foul play involved. Some of Patton's most trusted allies, including several of his fellow generals, expressed doubts about the official narrative. They suspected that Patton had been silenced for good reason. His views were seen as too extreme by the political establishment. The theory of Patton's assassination began to take hold as more details surfaced, painting a disturbing picture of a man who had become too dangerous for the political elites to tolerate. But what was the real motive behind Patton's death? Was it merely a case of political maneuvering, or was there something more sinister at play? To uncover the full extent of this conspiracy, We must look beyond the surface and explore the forces that may have played a role in his death and the far-reaching consequences of silencing one of America's greatest generals. The mystery surrounding General Patton's death only deepened as more details about the accident continued to surface. As the days passed, doubts began to mount not just among Patton's family and closest allies, but even within the U.S. government itself. The decision to bury Patton's death with such swiftness and certainty was unsettling. Was this the natural conclusion to a life of service? Or was the general's tragic end a calculated move to silence a dangerous voice? One of the most glaring inconsistencies surrounding Patton's death was the lack of any real investigation into the crash. Despite his high-profile status and the questionable circumstances, the Army's quick conclusion that it was an accident seemed rushed, almost too convenient. And then there was the strange behavior surrounding the aftermath of the incident. The Army's official report stated that Patton's car had been hit by a truck and that the accident had led to his paralysis, which ultimately caused his death. But there were no significant details about the truck driver and no investigation into the potential foul play. The absence of a thorough investigation raised questions that many, including Patton's family, found difficult to ignore. The Army's failure to dive deeper into the circumstances of the crash only fueled suspicions. Were those in power too eager to push the story of a car accident, or was there a more sinister plot that they were trying to cover up? And if it was an accident, why were there no other witnesses that could shed light on the incident? More disturbing still was the absence of immediate public outcry. Patton had been a national hero, but instead of receiving the scrutiny that was customary for figures of such importance, his death was treated with an unsettling quietness. Why was the public so willing to accept the official story? Was it because the authorities knew exactly how to handle the narrative, or was it because those in power had already closed ranks around the truth? Patton's family and his closest allies were not willing to let the matter rest. His wife, Beatrice, made it clear that she was not satisfied with the official conclusion. She was determined to find out what really happened to her husband, and she demanded that a more thorough investigation be conducted. But just as she had feared, the answers never came. No one in a position of power seemed interested in digging deeper into the mystery surrounding the crash. Theories began to emerge in the press and among Patton's friends. Some speculated that Patton's outspoken anti-Soviet stance had put him at odds with powerful individuals in the American government, particularly those who had already begun negotiating with Stalin's regime for post-war arrangements. As the Cold War loomed, Patton's insistence on confronting the Soviet Union made him a potential obstacle to the emerging diplomatic strategies of the U.S. and its allies. Was it possible that Patton's death was part of a covert effort to remove him from the political scene before he could undermine the American-Soviet alliance? One theory that gained traction was that Patton had been deliberately targeted by those who saw him as a threat. A handful of high-ranking military and political figures who had grown wary of Patton's influence were thought to have orchestrated the crash. It was rumored that they had staged the accident to make it look like an unfortunate event, while ensuring that Patton could not continue to spread his views on the Soviet Union or interfere with the political landscape of the post-war world. Could Patton's death have been engineered by his own government? Was this an assassination that was masked as a tragic accident? But the most chilling aspect of the theory was not just the possibility of a conspiracy. It was the fact that Patton had made his concerns known in the days leading up to his death. Several people who were close to Patton reported that he had openly expressed fears about his own safety. He had a sense of foreboding, telling some of his colleagues that he felt someone was out to get him. Was he aware of the danger he faced? Had he known that his outspokenness and his growing influence had made him a target for those who wanted him silenced? But there's a darker side to the story that hasn't been fully uncovered. What if the conspiracy to silence Patton went even deeper than just a few high-ranking officials? What if the entire crash was meticulously orchestrated with a level of precision that left no trace behind? As we dig deeper into the events surrounding his death, we uncover a shocking possibility, one that reveals the far-reaching influence of those who feared what Patton represented. Patton's alleged assassination was not just about his political views. His death, some argue, could have been part of a larger game, one that involved not just the U.S. government, but also powerful forces in Europe. Many believe that Patton had become too dangerous for the peace that was being brokered, especially as tensions with the Soviet Union grew. Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric and his desire to confront Stalin directly may have made him a threat to the status quo. In the years following his death, numerous books and articles would surface, suggesting that Patton had indeed been assassinated. Some of the most compelling theories were put forward by people who were close to the general, claiming that the crash was too convenient, too well-timed to be a mere accident. For these individuals, Patton's death seemed orchestrated by those who had more to gain by removing him from the picture. But despite the compelling evidence and the unanswered questions, the truth of Patton's death remains elusive. One of the most surprising revelations came from those who worked with Patton in the aftermath of the war. According to some sources, Patton had been preparing to return to the United States with a clear plan to confront the rising tide of Soviet power. He was said to have been in regular contact with key figures in Washington, expressing his thoughts on the future of Europe and America's role in defeating Soviet influence. Could it be that these very contacts were what sealed his fate? Did Patton's willingness to act against Soviet expansion threaten not just the U.S. government, but those with power in both the military and the political spheres? As we unravel the evidence, one question remains at the heart of this mystery. Did General Patton's death truly come at the hands of a sinister conspiracy? Or was it a tragic accident that the world simply couldn't understand? The answers may lie deeper than we ever imagined. The twists in the story of General Patton's death continue to unfold, and the more we look into it, the darker the plot becomes. While some believed that the general's vocal opposition to Soviet influence and his stance on post-war Europe were enough to make him a target, a deeper and more disturbing theory suggests something far more insidious. Patton's death may have been planned not just by a few influential individuals, but by an entire network of operatives who saw him as a threat to not just international peace but to their own power. One of the most compelling aspects of this theory lies in the nature of Patton's accident itself. As we have seen, the crash that led to his paralysis occurred under strange circumstances. A truck moving at a slow speed allegedly collided with Patton's car. The injuries that Patton sustained, particularly the severity of the neck injury, seemed disproportionate to the impact of the crash. The notion that someone of Patton's military experience, someone who had survived the most brutal of battlefields, could be taken down in such a way was hard to accept. This brings us to the theory of an intentional manipulation of the accident itself. What if the crash wasn't just the result of poor driving or bad luck, but rather part of a larger plan to incapacitate Patton? Some historians and conspiracy theorists argue that this was no random accident. It was a carefully orchestrated move to neutralize a man who had become increasingly difficult to control. The most shocking aspect of this theory is the possibility that Patton was deliberately targeted by the very people who had once been his allies. Could it be that Patton had been set up, placed in a situation where an accident could occur, and his influence within the American military and political establishment could be extinguished without anyone questioning the true cause? To complicate matters further, new evidence started to emerge years after Patton's death, evidence that suggested the possibility of foul play. Declassified documents from the U.S. government began to surface, revealing that Patton had become deeply suspicious of the Soviet Union's intentions in Europe. Patton's personal letters and private conversations indicated that he feared the Soviets were not just a threat to Eastern Europe, but to the entire post-war order that the Allies had established. Was this level of fear justified, or was it simply the rhetoric of a man who had lost touch with reality? Whatever the case, Patton had become a figure that many feared could disrupt the delicate balance of post-war diplomacy. It's important to note that Patton's death occurred during a highly volatile moment in history. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and the United States and the Soviet Union were entering a new and dangerous phase of their relationship. The stakes were high, and many believed that Patton's outspoken attitude towards the Soviets made him an obstacle to those who sought to maintain a more peaceful approach to international diplomacy. Patton had been advocating for a tougher stance against the Soviet Union, and his desire to confront Stalin head-on likely made him more enemies in Washington than anyone cared to admit. But what if Patton's death was only the beginning of a much bigger cover-up? Was his death part of a broader strategy to silence anyone who might challenge the post-war status quo? The more we uncover about the circumstances surrounding Patton's death, the more it seems like there were forces at play that wanted to keep his influence and his controversial views quiet. The evidence supporting the theory that Patton's death was not an accident continues to grow. In addition to the strange circumstances of the crash, there is the fact that Patton's bodyguard, Major General Hobart Gay, was one of the first people to voice concerns about the incident. Gay had been with Patton during some of the most critical moments of the war, and his trust in Patton was unquestionable. But after the accident, Gay reportedly became suspicious of the official version of events. He even went as far as to question whether the crash was the result of a deliberate attack. But perhaps the most startling revelation came from a series of secret documents discovered years later. These documents, which were initially classified, seemed to support the theory that Patton's death was part of a larger, carefully planned conspiracy. The papers revealed that key individuals in the U.S. military had discussed the possibility of removing Patton from the political scene due to his growing influence and his political views. It seemed that the general had become a pawn in a much larger political game, and those in power had decided that he was more valuable to them dead than alive. The timing of Patton's death also played a crucial role in fueling the conspiracy theory. It came at a pivotal moment in history, just after the war had ended, but before the world had settled into a new post-war order. Patton's death, just as he was preparing to return to the United States, signified the end of a potential challenge to the growing influence of the Soviet Union. By removing Patton from the equation, the individuals who orchestrated his death ensured that he would not become a figurehead for a new anti-Soviet movement. But there's more to the story. The shocking truth of Patton's death and the conspiracy that may have surrounded it could explain the strange series of events that followed. How did the U.S. government handle Patton's death? Was it truly the result of an accident, or was it a part of something far more intricate? The answers to these questions could change the way we understand not just Patton's life but the very nature of power in post-war America. Despite the many theories, doubts, and unanswered questions surrounding General George Patton's death, the U.S. government swiftly closed the case. There was no formal investigation, no deep dive into the strange circumstances, and no official acknowledgement that Patton's death may have been anything other than a tragic accident. The official story was final. A car crash led to the general's death. But as the years went by, the unanswered questions only deepened, and Patton's death became a defining moment in the history of post-war America. In the years following his death, the mystery of Patton's demise remained a focal point for conspiracy theorists, historians, and those who had known him best. The lack of an investigation into his death, especially considering Patton's stature as one of the greatest generals of the 20th century, seemed almost deliberate. But why? Why was there such reluctance to investigate the circumstances of Patton's death, and why did those in power seem so eager to move on from it? One possibility is that Patton's death was simply too politically dangerous to examine closely. He had become a political figure, not just a military leader. His outspoken anti-Soviet views, combined with his growing popularity in certain circles, made him a wild card in a time when the U.S. was trying to solidify its influence in a post-war world. Patton's leadership, had he remained alive, could have threatened the fragile peace being brokered between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The idea of Patton challenging the status quo of Cold War diplomacy made some in the American government uneasy. If he had lived, Patton could have inspired a movement against Soviet expansion, challenging American policymakers who were intent on avoiding direct confrontation with Stalin's regime. Another possibility is that Patton had become a liability to the U.S. military leadership. He was known to have made enemies within the higher ranks, not just because of his political views, but because of his unrelenting confidence and his abrasive personality. Patton had rubbed many of his superiors the wrong way with his outspoken leadership style, and some believed that he would have been a dangerous figure if left unchecked. For those in power, a general like Patton, someone who didn't hesitate to speak his mind and act on his beliefs, could not be allowed to gain too much influence. But the most chilling part of this entire conspiracy is the idea that Patton's death wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern where powerful figures within the U.S. government and military were willing to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their post-war vision. Patton's death may have been just the first in a series of silenced voices. His death sent a powerful message to those who might have questioned the actions of the government in the years following the war. Speaking out against the prevailing powers could come at a terrible price. But Patton's legacy, even after his death, continues to inspire debate. Was his death part of a larger conspiracy to eliminate him as a threat? Or was it simply a tragic accident in a world that was changing too rapidly for a man like him to keep up? Regardless of how his death occurred, Patton's legacy has remained a powerful symbol of resistance to the Soviet threat, resistance to the forces of political conformity, and resistance to the system that sought to silence him. As time has passed, Patton's legacy has only grown more complex. His military genius remains undisputed. His leadership during the war was pivotal in the Allied victory. His ability to think outside the box, to outsmart his enemies and outmaneuver his allies, made him one of the most celebrated military figures in history. But his post-war stance, particularly his opposition to Soviet influence, has made him a symbol for those who believe in the necessity of confronting totalitarian regimes head-on. For those who view Patton as a martyr, his death is seen as a tragic loss. His death, they argue, marked the end of a man who had the potential to change the course of history. Patton had the military expertise, the influence, and the vision to shape the future of Europe and America after the war. But instead of becoming a leader in the post-war world, he was silenced. To this day, Patton's death remains an unresolved mystery. While some have accepted the official story that it was simply an accident, others continue to believe that his death was a calculated move to prevent him from challenging the political powers of the time. Whether Patton was deliberately killed or simply caught in the crossfire of post-war politics, his death serves as a reminder of how dangerous it can be to challenge the prevailing power sand of the price that some must pay for speaking out. But one question lingers. If Patton's death was orchestrated, who were the players involved? And how far did the conspiracy reach within the halls of power? The answers may never be fully known, but the mystery of Patton's death remains one of the greatest unsolved stories of the 20th century. General George S. Patton's death remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. Was it simply an accident, or was he silenced to protect a post-war order? Throughout his career, Patton challenged the status quo and refused to bow to political pressures. His death, whether orchestrated or coincidental, leaves us with more questions than answers. Was Patton killed because of his outspoken opposition to Soviet influence? Or was there a more dangerous agenda at play, one involving powerful figures within the U.S. government and military? The theories are many, but the truth is still elusive. The story of Patton's death is more than just about a man's tragic end. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of speaking truth to power and the price that those who challenge the prevailing narrative sometimes have to pay. As history unfolds, the facts about his death may remain hidden, but the impact of his life and his death will continue to reverberate through history. What do you think happened to General Patton? Was his death an accident, or was it part of a larger conspiracy to silence a man who stood in the way of political agendas? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think General Patton was the victim of a conspiracy? Leave your opinion in the comments. If you found this investigation into Patton's death eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. We'll continue to explore other hidden truths of history's secrets, conspiracies, and the lives of those who changed the course of events. You won't want to miss what's coming next. In our next episode, we dive into another shocking conspiracy. Was JFK's assassination truly the work of a lone gunman, or was it a carefully planned operation by those in power? The truth might be more disturbing than you think. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our series on the mysteries of history.